Welcome to In Substantia, where we explore ideas and challenge assumptions. My name is Gabor Farkas. Today, we are taking a closer look at China, but not through the usual headlines. Instead of focusing on trade wars, tech tensions, or diplomatic standoffs, we're asking what's really going on beneath the surface of Europe-China relations. What cultural mindsets, leadership styles, and historical narratives shape the way China engages the world and the way the world responds? To help us unpack this, I'm joined by Gabor Holch. Gabor is an intercultural leadership consultant, author, and speaker who has lived and worked in China and across Asia for over 2 decades. He's not here to comment as a politician or a strategist. He brings something just as important, a deep understanding of how people think, how leaders behave, and how cultures meet, clash, and sometimes find common ground. So whether you're a policymaker, a curious citizen, or just someone trying to make sense of global shifts, this episode is for you. Let's get started. To begin, let's start with a bit of personal grounding. Gabor, you have lived and worked across East Asia for over 2 decades. Your perspective blends intercultural insight with lived experience during China's most transformative years. So you have spent those 2 decades working in around China. Could you start by sharing what originally brought you to East Asia and how those early experiences shaped your understanding of China's global role?
Well, first of all, Gabor, thank you very much for having me on the show. And the nice introduction. I really look forward to an honest discussion because, as you know, in Hungarian culture, people who share the same first name, they have a special relationship with each other. So as far as China is concerned, actually, I was one of those young people who, for some inexplicable reason, suddenly started to have a fixation with a geographic area, which was what we called the Far East in English in those days. So it was not such a culturally loaded term. I was an expat kid in the Middle East, so part of my interest in different culture comes from there. My father was an engineer in Iraq in the late 70s, so this is where I spent 5 formative years of my childhood. Then we went back to Budapest, which is my birth city. And then I just suddenly started being interested in East Asian martial arts, languages. At that time, I learned Japanese. Then I became a student. I read about Far Eastern philosophy, history. And then as I went on to study first languages and philosophy, then international relations, then later on the graduate level, I was trained as a diplomat. I just kept this interest and basically turned it into a professional specialization. So by the time I got my diploma at the Diplomatic Academy of Vienna, I was officially a specialist of Asia-Europe relations, or specifically the East Asia relations of the European Union. And then I found it difficult to get commissioned to East Asia as a junior diplomat. I was working for international organizations such as United Nations and a security organization called OSCE. And then because my bosses didn't want to send me there, I just basically quit my budding diplomatic career, packed 2 suitcases, went to China in 2002. I thought it was a 2-year sabbatical, but it turned out to be a 20-year career. And then eventually in 2005, I started the consulting practice that today I call East-West Leadership. It started with a different name. It started with a local Chinese business partner. Now I run it with a small team, and we train, coach, and advise senior executives and sometimes diplomats in working between East and West.
That lived experience gives you a unique lens into how misunderstandings arise between systems. China and Europe operate with different assumptions about power, negotiation, and reciprocity. So based on your first-hand experience with both Chinese and European institutions, what are some common misconceptions Europeans still hold about China and thinks and acts in global affairs?
Well, the starting problem is that we have no shortage of stereotypes, but we have a shortage of first-hand information. And obviously, it's understandable knowing the geographic differences. And obviously, when a human being starts suspecting that somebody approaches them with stereotypes in mind, then we usually start resisting and resenting. This is where all intercultural problems start. When it comes to Europe and let's say China or the East Asian region more generally, I think very often it's a problem of scale. Because, all right, if somebody from China or Japan doesn't know the intimate differences between, let's say, Hungarian, Greek, and Dutch culture, I think it's more understandable than putting together an enormous geographic area like East Asia or even as China under one basic roof. So this kind of lack of awareness is a big problem. And then I would highlight two more. One of them is the level of conflict tolerance in Eastern and Western cultures. They are extremely different from each other. In East Asian cultures, basically, it is not polite to admit there is direct conflict between cooperating parties. So basically, the communication tries to avoid the appearance of conflict. Whereas in many Western cultures, a clash of ideas and then lets the best idea win is very much at the heart of negotiation culture, teamwork culture, and leadership culture. So conflict tolerance would be one that I would mention as a frequent area of misunderstandings and clashes. And then the other one is flexibility towards what we consider as a done deal or as an agreement. And because of many historical reasons, the West, including North America and Europe, had become a very codified culture when we do business with each other. We want things on paper. We want things very explicit. Whereas in East Asia, very often, the agreements, first of all, they are more personal than written. And then the other thing is there is a higher level of flexibility towards what we actually have to deliver after the agreement has been made. So there is an attitude that the environment changes, so obviously the agreement has to change with it in an organic manner. And very often we misunderstand each other that way.
The Europeans often underestimate the importance of historical memory, relational hierarchy, and implicit authority in Chinese leadership culture. What can you tell us about that?
Well, both cultures have a very, very sharp awareness of the importance of history. I mean, let's say if you're American and then you take a walk in a European city, everywhere you will find reminders of what happened here before. Historical buildings, plaques on the wall, some famous people was born here or some famous person lived there. And also, more traditional clothing, for example, for men from North America. This can be a challenge doing business in Europe. Not only you have to wear traditional attire, but you have to wear a different kind of traditional attire if you, let's say, do business in London or in Milan. So both cultures are actually taking history quite seriously. But then if you want to look at how history appears differently in Asia, then you will notice that if you take a walk in Shanghai or even in Beijing, despite the awareness in China of what they say is 5,000 years of history, you are not going to run into these old buildings, traditional outfits, and plaques on the wall about who lived there so often. So the history is more a kind of organic history that is in the DNA of the people who represent this culture. And this makes it much harder for outsiders to align with those historical traditions, because it's not so visible. If you go to the Middle East, if you go to India, people dress in a traditional way. Already that's a pointer. Be careful, because it's easy to make a cultural mistake here. But if you go to Japan or China, businessmen dress very similar to European business, and businesswomen wear more or less European fashion. But then underneath, as you said, these kind of unspoken hierarchies can be very convoluted. And then finally, especially when it comes to China, what is important to know that it's not just us foreigners who are a little bit confused, but even local people are a little bit confused because there have been so many historical resets to tradition, right? So many cataclysms in history and so many leaders who wanted to just wipe out tradition and start from zero, that there are many parallel traditional systems in China. So if you do business with, let's say, academics, then it's a very traditional, almost Confucian system that you operate in. If you work with a state-owned company, then this kind of Marxist-Leninist hierarchy with the Communist Party on top is what you need to understand. If you work with a company like BYD or Alibaba, then you are operating in a multinational corporate hierarchy. And this makes it a little bit difficult at the beginning. But again, I already shared with you certain logical trends that help you to align yourself.
Mm-hmm. Let's shift now to the state of EU-China relations today. Amid rising geopolitical tensions, Europe is trying to recalibrate its posture towards China. How would you describe the current state of EU-China relations?
If I wanted to find the best word, I think it's confusion, perplexity. It is that so people try to simplify complex narratives. So are we, a little bit like American politicians do, are we enemies or are we allies? Are you going in the right direction or the wrong direction? So this is something that China and the EU has been trying to do for a very long time. And I remember very well, in 2008, I made my first Mandarin language keynote speech. And it was about renewable energy because I was invited to speak in Beijing for the Chinese Renewable Energy Association. And the speech was about neither China nor the European Union can meet their renewable energy targets without the other, right? Because China at the time needed the scientific data. This 2008, remember, needed the scientific data, needed the technological know-how, needed the global cooperation that the EU could help China with. And Europe needed the affordable and fast-moving manufacturing that delivered anything from solar panels to electronics to wind turbines or whatever it is. So at that time, the very simplistic narrative was there is this kind of emerging global picture and we are puzzle pieces that fit together in the middle. And then now, certain people would like to see it as a zero-sum competition. We are both on LinkedIn. We can see posts which says, that the West is declining, China is taking over. Look at those medieval European car companies. They are slow. They are fidgeting with stupid little details. Whereas in the meantime, China has superior technology and then has the manufacturing that is affordable. Chinese cars are cheaper and better and so on. But we have to be very careful with these narratives because these two geographic regions, these two, let's say, sectors, they are cross-invested in each other in a very convoluted way. So whichever drowns will drag the other one down with itself. And now I think both political and business leaders don't really know what the next good step would be. So this would be my basic summary. China looks at Europe and asks, so are you competing with us? Are you trying to stop us? There are certain signs. Are you going to align with the United States in this fairly confusing fight against China? And Europe is looking at China and says, we see why you would be an amazing market for us. We see all the benefits of cooperation in technology, in environment, in everything. So why are you supporting the biggest threat to European security? So there are all these questions which are unanswered for this. I can elaborate, but I think most of our listeners will know what we are talking about.
Would you say we are in a phase of cautious engagement, managed rivalry, and probably not yet strategic disengagement because we can get past all the difficulties that you mentioned?
Well, let me play with these words a little bit and say cautious disengagement.
And cautious disengagement.
Yes. I do think so. So on many different levels. Let's go through 3 levels very quickly. The big picture strategic level. where business and national security, they are intertwined with each other. Then let's go down to the institutional, organizational level of companies, embassies, and so on. And then we can even go down to the personal level. So on the highest level, simply, we cannot say it's cautious engagement, because engagement, it implies a direction of increasing alignment and what do you call codependence, so to speak. This is really not the point right now. So if you look at corporations, there are certain corporations which depend on China. So if you look at a European corporation like ASML, if you look at a European corporation like Daimler-Benz, we could say many others, BASF, the chemical company. I mean, they wouldn't even survive at the moment without the Chinese market. But even they start rearranging their eggs in different baskets, because they really don't know where political factors will take them in the next 5 or 10 years. And then states, exactly the same way. Basically, because I'm a diplomatic graduate, so I have friends all over these large organizations, UN, World Bank, NATO, European Union, so on. Last weekend, I was at our reunion in Vienna, so we had a lot of chats about these things. So in the EU, there is this kind of if-then mentality. If China keeps progressing in this direction of closer alignment to Russia, for example, then they simply cannot afford to be more engaged with China, whatever the benefits are, right? But if this is not the case, then of course everybody wants deeper engagement, but people cannot make up their minds yet. So on the corporate level, when you do your planning for the next year, next 5 years, you have to take this into consideration, and you have to create a plan A and plan B. And basically you have to listen to your gut. Which one is plan A and which one is plan B? Engagement or disengagement, because nobody has the data about the future. And then finally, if you look at the personal level, I can tell you, in comparison to 10 years or 12 years ago, if you talk to people who have options, if you talk to people who, that they are not hoping to get a job, but they are choosing between different offers and so on, all other things being equal, whether they can go to China or travel more often to China or not, now they will choose not. Everybody has a different reason, but as a large trend, this is where we are going right now. In comparison to 10 or 12 years ago, the attractiveness of China has decreased significantly.
Building on that, let's dig deeper into Europe's internal dynamics. While the EU speaks of strategic autonomy, energy dependence, trade ties, and defense reliance complicate that ambition. Beyond the headlines, is the EU capable of acting strategically on its own terms, or is it still trapped between dependency on the US and growing exposure to China?
I think these are the same things, essentially. So I think the EU, in terms of regional and national security and energy dependency and everything else, is a little bit like a middle-aged man who got recently divorced. And then he says to himself, okay, from now on, I'm going to cook myself and I'm going to do my own laundry. So on one hand, of course you are, because you have no other options. You have to look after yourself. On the other hand, it doesn't mean that it's going to cause you any kind of pleasure, and it doesn't mean that you are going to maintain the same standards as before. And the EU is exactly in the same kind of situation. It's obvious. So if you look at it, and if you go to Brussels, or if you go to, let's say, a NATO summit, or if you go to a UN summit, the way you imagine the EU literally in the middle between the US and China is that threat levels are rising on one hand, because China is becoming a more dominant player with much more aggressive ambitions towards the international system. And exactly at the same time, the sense of security from the United States is decreasing, again, for reasons which are indigenous to the United States. So obviously the EU is saying, okay, we have to take care of our own dirty laundry from now on. It is not a choice. Very few people are happy about it. But of course, everybody tries to think about this as adults, so to speak. I hear people from the Merrick's Institute. I hear people from national governments. And if you take them aside for a beer, or you like meet them in any kind of relaxed environments, they are not going to say this is a letdown by the United States. What they usually say is, it's weird that we came this far with the United States basically unequivocally picking up the bill for these things. This moment was coming sooner or later. Just like the United States is thinking the same way about Pacific security. Is that, of course, this is a system we inherited from the Second World War, but sooner or later it had to change. Now it's changing. And then everybody's trying to do the best they can under circumstances. I don't know if it's a good answer to your question. This is the way I see it.
It's a perfect answer if it's the way you see it. I mean, the term strategic autonomy is also complicated to understand because it's not interpreted the same way across member states. And so, yeah, it's difficult to assess what it really means.
What comes to my mind from this is let's go back mentally 10 years in time and let's look at how many things looked impossible 10 years ago. And we took that hurdle with relative grace and ease, right? If somebody told us, at that time, for example, if you look at certain Western European economies, Germany at the top of this pile, and its dependence on Russian energy, and then somebody would have said, well, listen, you just have to find a way to cut 2/3 of that dependence on Russian energy in about 5 years. Anybody in Berlin or Brussels would have thought this person is on some kind of very weird designer drug, right? Of course, it's completely impossible. Or look at what we did during the pandemic. If somebody told us, I think there is going to be this weird virus, and then we have to lock down countries entirely, and we have to triple the output of the National Healthcare Service while the economy is struggling. So I think this person would have been sent to Hollywood, like, try to sell this to Warner Brothers, but and look how well we've done, right? Mm-hmm. The threat today is not that we wrecked everything because of energy dependency or we wrecked everything because of the pandemic. The main concern is new crises that we invent, which look very much like Cold War time crises. So we kind of glided through these first of its kind cataclysms. And now we are back with things which are, human history.
Let's look a little bit at the tensions within Europe itself. Beijing's bilateral engagement with Central and Eastern European countries have sparked concern in Brussels. China's bilateral relationships with Hungary, Serbia, and other Central and Eastern European countries have raised concerns in Brussels about strategic fragmentation. How deliberate is this approach, and what are its long-term consequences, or what might be its long-term consequences?
Well, so first of all, this is an excellent question, how deliberate it is. And then secondly, if I could answer this question clearly, that would mean I am just coming from Beijing with from a chat with President Xi Jinping. And in this case, probably I wouldn't be on this podcast. So I know a couple of people who are in that position, but they are not very willing to talk about it, and certainly not on air. But I will tell you the best I can. So based on 20 years of being a corporate consultant, a leadership consultant in China, based on speaking the language, so having some exposure to local media, for example, or having friends in government, in party, in corporations, having chats with them, sometimes very unfiltered ones. I am not a believer in this 2-century master plan by China. I know that this is a meme. I know that it would explain many things. If you look at long-term curves, good and bad in China, so economic development, rearmament, debt trap diplomacy, Belt and Road, things like this, it would explain a lot. But I do not believe that the Chinese leaders who actually replace one another with fairly abrupt policy changes not every 4 or 5 years like in democracies, but let's say every 10 or 15 years. I don't think they have this kind of continuous narrative that each of these leaders is just, adding its own chapter to it. I also don't believe that an organization like the Communist Party of China would have the technocratic insight into the factors that we are talking about here that would allow such a plan. So when we look at, for example, a dynamic Western Europe and Eastern Europe, the way China engages countries like mine, Hungary, but also Serbia, for example. And then as opposed to these countries, its relation to the Baltic nations. And then when we look at the West, and when we look at China's relations with the UK, Germany, Italy, and then a lot of people suddenly have this moment of clarity like, aha, this is a divide and conquer plan by China. It is so smart. And now that I think about this, it has been going on for the last 50 years, right? We celebrated, in the media, they like to call it the 50th anniversary of diplomatic relations between China and the EU, momentarily forgetting that the EU was not there 50 years ago. But anyway, people tend to see this kind of, I don't think so. I think there are certain things that work out for the benefit of China. And then they stumble onto this and they realize, this is working. Maybe we can pile onto this a little bit more. And then certain things that don't work out. And China said, okay, let's not put resources into this because it hasn't worked out. So example for the first one is Hungary, right? Neither Hungary nor China had this diabolical master plan to use Hungary as a foothold or a bridgehead for China in the European Union. But China was at the right place in Hungary at the right time. The Hungarian government was very welcoming to the kind of investment and kind of political engagement, because at the time, Hungarian political rhetoric was turned against the European Union as a kind of federalist-minded entity. And this was a great enough combination for both sides to double down on it. And then on the other hand, if we look at, for example, Italy's role in the Belt and Road Initiative, that is an example that they tried. It didn't work out. Both sides withdrew, both the financial and the political capital. And they say, okay, let's give this a rest. But I think there are more surprises in store in the future.
So you were talking of Hungary and Serbia. The Budapest-Belgrade railway has become emblematic of China's infrastructure diplomacy in Europe.
Right.
Taking the Budapest-Belgrade railway as a case study, how should we assess these infrastructures projects? Are they expressions of mutual benefit, or are they skewed in favor of Chinese strategic objectives?
Again, I see the benefit for, let's say, a journalist of taking sides between these different narratives. But I don't think the benefit for anybody else, basically politicians, business decision makers. So if we look at the Budapest-Belgrade railway case, if it's a complete disaster, if it's a triumph, we really have to pick our indicators very carefully, right? So this story has been going on for about, easily 10 years, let's say. And then if we look at the simply logistical, tactical, tangible benefits, then obviously I remember I taught at a business course at Jiaotong University about 12 years ago. I used the Budapest-Belgrade Railway as a case study, and the vision that we had, or certain people had at that time, of people just, happily boarding a China-style high-speed train, the way you travel from Shanghai to Beijing. Obviously, that hasn't realized. So there is no such trip between Budapest and Belgrade. But then somebody would say, well, that might not be the deliverable anyway. It is a test case for the business model or something like this. Okay, let's look at that. Has it delivered for, and I'm using air quotes for the benefit of people who are just listening to us, the people. And of course, we have to look at which people, right? So if we look at it as an investment, if we look at it as a case of corruption, which is also a valid point, if we look at it as a case of an infrastructural project which binds two nations or three nations together in diplomatic efforts, then you are going to make different judgments whether it delivered or not. I think at this point, it is not a success case. It is not an entirely successful case. This is the reason why, let's say, other European countries outside of the EU and European Union countries are not basically jumping on the bandwagon, literally speaking, because it's not something like, look at that. It's like, I think the China-Myanmar train line is mainly probably a more positive case. And then other countries say that we want that too, right? In Europe, it's not so clear. There has been, if we look at the efficiency, how much money resulted in what kind of tangible results, if we look at the difficulties, if we look at how much money disappeared, if we look at how clear the future is about what this line will be used for, I think it's a mixed bag.
I didn't want to bring up the money that has disappeared and that has drawn EU scrutiny. But I wanted to ask you how that line, that train connection between Budapest and Belgrade compares to the train line that China has built between Addis Ababa and the sea.
Oh, this is really as far from my field of expertise as Addis Ababa itself. So I know very, very little about it. What I can tell you is that if you look at, so I am not so familiar with the case of the train connecting Addis Ababa or let's say the China-Pakistan corridor and so on. There are many different examples, but it's extremely important that when China tries to export the business model of high-speed trains, we should never forget that the original successful, let's call it successful business model, is entirely internal, right? So China has a minister for the train network. That person is personally accountable. And we all know what happens, or if you don't, then look it up on the internet, what happens to a minister like this when, God forbid, there is an accident, people die. But also, that fits into a master plan, right? China's 5-year plan gives very, very clear deliverables for companies like the Chinese national railways. And then now you take this business model and you export it to Myanmar, to Pakistan, to African countries, to Hungary and Serbia, and so on. Suddenly you don't have the same level of accountability. Suddenly you cannot just, if somebody makes a huge mistake or some money disappears and you don't know where, you cannot just make that phone call and call the responsible person to Beijing. You have you don't have the same kind of leverage from China's side. And then you asked me about China basically, how do you say, using these projects as a brand building exercise in an unbalanced way. That is obviously the case, but that is simply because China is better at this kind of national image building than either of the countries that we mentioned so far. So on this high level, I can talk about it because I know corporate leaders from Deutsche Bahn, corporate leaders from infrastructure companies that have been involved. I know diplomats who are dealing with this on a national level. Of course, I've never dealt with the technical details of these railway lines.
We have to look at, as you mentioned, how hard China has been working on its global brand. But China's economic and rhetorical support for Moscow has unsettled Europe. China's alignment with Russia since the invasion of Ukraine has created serious discomfort in Europe. Do you think this alliance is purely tactical, or does it reflect a deeper ideological or geopolitical convergence?
You mean the one between China and Russia?
Yes, China and Russia.
Yes, I think this is the head and the heart battling each other, as it's very often the case with human alliances. So historically speaking, there is a very, very deep convergence between China and Russia, which goes back to the origin of the Marxist-Leninist movement in Eurasia, right? So both Russia and China is really working hard to forget that Marxism-Leninism was something that was developed in Germany and the United Kingdom as an ideology. And originally, it dictated that economies get to a certain level of industrial and social development so that they can start building communism. And this is why, ideologically speaking, Marxism and Marxism-Leninism or Maoism is different, because Marxism-Leninism and Maoism say, well, if the party plays a strong enough leading role, then you can jump over this stage of industrial and social development. And this is a very, very strong bond, let's say, between Stalin and Mao Zedong, and then, the big elders of this era, including Ho Chi Minh and so on. So we go back to this era, and both Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping have this idea of reviving the glory of the early days of party development, the way the party leads the people who need to be led. And then that's when the problems start, right? Because Moscow always imagines itself as the core of this developmental process, simply because they pride historical figures like Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin, who are basically, if you listen to speeches of Xi Jinping today, he will still refer to the wisdom of those leaders. So in Moscow's minds, obviously, we know what's the center and who are the followers. But then, of course, China has its own idea about this. So there we already have a source of conflict. And then it becomes a power play. And the very interesting thing about the beginning of China's support of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine is it goes back to the Winter Olympics of 2022, when basically the way the European Union saw it is that there was this joint declaration by Putin and President Xi of the unconditional friendship of the two nations. And then very shortly afterwards, Russia attacking Ukraine, which, if you don't know too much about the dynamics and just look at from the outside, it's a very, very clear message. Inferred message, probably not true. This is number one. Number two, if you accept that recreating the territorial integrity of what used to be the Soviet Union then is a justifiable historical aim, then of course you look at the war against the Ukraine through completely different lenses. So I think very, very few people can go deep enough into this ideological environment to see things this way. And then anybody who can would find it very difficult to have a meaningful dialogue in Brussels. And that is extremely disturbing, right? So it's, in my personal opinion, as a former student of philosophy and then diplomacy, it's an as difficult conversation as you would have with any kind of fundamentalism, right? There are so deep value clashes in this conversation that it's very hard to move on from there. And the EU is looking to China right now to help them resolve this contradiction. So wait a minute, how can you want to be the leader of a new international order when you're actively undermining the existing international order? I'm not saying this conversation is clearly leading anywhere on either side at the moment, but this seems to be at the core.
In 2023, the trade between China and Russia has hit record highs. But there's a historical mistrust and competing ambitions in Central Asia. So what would you say the conditions are in the alliance between China and Russia?
Well, as an executive coach, I always start from empathy. And it's a kind of visualization exercise. Just sit down and try to put yourself into the shoes of the leader of Russia, leader of China, or even somebody in an important decision-making position in Russia or China. You can try to put yourself into the shoes of Ren Zhengfei, who's the founder of Huawei, or you can try to put yourself into the shoes of a Russian energy minister, something like this. Everybody's cornered by this new situation. Everybody is cornered, and very few people see good options. So I truly believe, again, this is why I don't, for example, believe in this kind of Chinese master plan to rule the world, right? Because these are not preferred options. These are all options that are the consequences of a bad turn of events, right? I mean, I see in China, both on the political level and on the corporate level, a genuine desire to both join and improve an existing international order. I really, really see that. So I don't think certain Chinese decision makers are trying to be these kind of puppet masters who play out one side against the other. When somebody from China, it can be Wang Yi, it can be Xi Jinping, it can be an individual corporate leader, says, listen, let's sit together and let's try to find a constructive solution. I believe in their best intentions, but there are very, very few good options here. Right? Especially, for example, just imagine that you are one of these Chinese decision makers and something began to emerge. And then suddenly what is happening in the United States now? I mean, if you really feel empathy with that Chinese decision maker, you really feel like crying because so many acceptable options have been destroyed because of this tariff war, for example. Or just imagine how you would see the hypocrisy of complaining about China's rearmament and intentions in the Pacific, while suddenly, as we speak, the United States is contemplating to basically support Israel's war against Iran. So really, if you put yourself into the shoes of those people, you really don't understand how anybody can seriously think these are viable directions, right? I think, and then ultimately, again, as a leadership coach who works most of the time with corporate decision makers, but I also have coachees from Brussels, from the EU system, United Nations, and so on. Let's never forget that in the center of all these concentric circles of power, these are human beings. These are vulnerable human beings who question themselves, who have, apart from their political or business persona, they have a personal persona, right? They worry about their property, they worry about their family, they worry about the future of their nation, and they are trying to make the choices that give some sustainability to these kind of things. And then even momentarily, they just align with the side that gives them the most hope of realizing their own goals. I think if we look back in 5 or 50 years to the current day, what we will see is nobody saw what they were doing. Nobody understood what the clear best choice of action, like best course of action is. I clearly see this in China. I clearly see this in the EU. Almost like everybody's looking at each other, hoping that some turn of events would rescue them from making regrettable choices.
You were saying, we're talking empathy and suggesting that as some of these persons, because of the complexity of the situation, might be crying. I was wondering if they are crying or if they are laughing.
Well, you can laugh if you don't have a stake in the game. And then you cry if you do, right? So this is why very often when we do not have empathy with the other side, like many American and European decision makers don't have empathy with the Chinese side, then they imagine them laughing because they imagine that they have no stake in the game. So when you look at, it's like everybody's talking about electric vehicles. And then when they say, okay, BYD is taking over the market in Europe, and even BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Tesla is struggling, not to mention some smaller brands which are trying to join the EV market, then people imagine China in this kind of big diabolical laughter, because exactly as some people see this narrative is the ailing, crumbling West versus the emerging East. But then if you say, well, did you know how deeply China's automotive industry and Germany's automotive industry are cross-invested in each other? If you imagine China laughing when Daimler-Benz collapses in a certain market segment, do you know how much the investment share as the stake of China is in Daimler-Benz, right? then you don't imagine them laughing anymore.
Mm-hmm.
If you say, do you know that China is still trying to prop up its own economy from exports, and they have just lost their largest export market to a great extent, the United States, because of the tariff wars. And obviously, Africa and Southeast Asia is not going to pick up all the the exportable goods, because China still tries to manufacture more, right? Southeast Asia altogether imports like less than a third of what the United States did. And now, they're really not laughing if the EU is in trouble, because the EU is China's best hope to keep up an export-driven economy.
Mm-hmm.
And then we don't imagine them laughing anymore. And I think that's the right attitude, because human empathy is evolutionarily, so through evolution it evolved so that the one human being, when it sees another one struggling, step up and say, well, what should we do? Right? This is where you are at a railway station and somebody starts like losing their balance on the escalator with a suitcase. There are 3 people who jump there and stop the suitcase. This is the kind of human response that we need right now.
Mm-hmm.
Because if that one person starts rolling down the escalator with a big suitcase, okay, you can start laughing like, what a loser, but then eventually the suitcase is coming your way.
As a student of philosophy, you know the concept of this too shall pass, right? And given the strong reactions of Chinese leaders, I thought that this is kind of the stance they were taking. We can resist, we don't mind, we have enough resources to take those tariffs, we'll raise them on our side too. Because maybe they were saying, this too shall pass. It's not sustainable for the United States. It's not sustainable for Europe.
Yes. So again, we have to look a little bit at how certain ideologies work. So the party's guiding ideology, and let me call it Marxism-Leninism, although some listeners might have an issue with that. But at the core, it's Marxism-Leninism. It is an ideology that based on a so-called teleological philosophy, which means time, history, progresses towards an end goal on an upward curve, right? This would be a contrast with, let's say, traditional Chinese Confucian mentality, which did not believe in historical development, so to speak. Like in the Confucian universe, everything stays the same, and the goal is to make everything stay the same. There is Tiansha, there is everything under heaven. If everybody plays their role, then you avoid cataclysm, then you avoid conflict, and everything goes on very smoothly into the indefinite future. It's also a contrast with, let's say, a Buddhist ideology, which says the universe is going around in circles. And then there are these kind of big epochs, and then they kind of repeat one another, or even you can say certain scientific models of the universe are cyclical. Teleological ideologies, that they basically say there are certain forces that clash in the world, and then one of them has to win and the other one has to lose. And this is where history is going. Like Christianity is also an ideology like this, right? We are moving towards good triumphing and evil being defeated. We don't know how long it is, and we don't know, and we are trying to be on the good side. Marxism-Leninism is exactly the same. So the triumph of communism is inevitable. It is not a question. And Marxism-Leninism differs from religions because it maintains to be scientifically based, right? So dialectical materialism, it basically says it's an upward curve. Communism will win, capitalism will lose. We don't know how long it takes. We don't know how many up and down curves we have until then, but this is absolutely inevitable. This gives the self-confidence to the Communist Party leadership that a democratic government can never have. That history, in the long run, is scientifically on our side. Nobody asks us, nobody asks you. This is the way it's going to happen. Just imagine if you believe in something like this, how much self-confidence that gives you, how much assumed clarity it gives you, right? So every time you seem to come out on top, you say, yes, of course, you see, we are winning. every time you are not winning, you say, well, this is obviously a temporary glitch. How do we overcome it as soon as possible? Right? Mm-hmm. A lot of communication that the West sees as propaganda is actually not propaganda, is this kind of mentality expressed in the newspaper, in speeches, when people talk to each other in the street. And then the rest of it is basically which side believes in it and which side doesn't. At the moment, this is a very useful ideology, for example, to contrast East and West, right? So I have Chinese family members. Some of them, my wife is from Shanghai. At the moment, we are living here in Budapest. Every time the train is late, it is a proof to many Chinese people that you see the West is falling and the East is rising. German people, Hungarian people, Italian people don't tend to see this way, right? A train being late is not the expression of some cosmic struggle between East and West. This is a big difference. But we also have to appreciate that this is a fundamental difference between the way we see the world. Simply, it has been proven many, many times. People who live in democracies, they don't care about the future of the nation that much. They are unwilling to take sacrifices to the same level, right? They don't. If you go to I don't know, a nation like Holland, or if you go to Canada, if you go to family, their goal in raising their children is not to raise a proud Dutch or a proud Canadian citizen. They think the state, the nation, is a service to the individual. So it's a kind of upside down approach. Maybe I'm getting a little bit too philosophical here.
No. It's interesting. I mean, to some extent, that philosophy maybe doesn't match. I mean, it's not something that can apply to a nationality. It sometimes can apply to the way you support a football club.
No. Listen, if somebody said that, I don't know, a prophet came down from the sky and told me that Ipswich will eventually be world champion, that's the kind of self-confidence we are talking about, right? Because in religions, in Marxism, Leninism, it's written that our side will win. Whereas if you root for a football club, you root for them even if they keep losing over your lifetime. Yes. It's a kind of emotional attachment.
I understand the nuance. Yes. We have to look at something a bit more concrete. The philosophical aspect is cultural aspect is really essential, but let's look at BRICS. So BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, it's an alliance to some extent. And BRICS has expanded and is often portrayed as a challenge to Western-led global order. Could Europe engage meaningfully with this grouping, or is it structurally excluded from this emerging alignment?
Yeah, I mean, we are not starting from a hopeful starting point, because if you look at BRICS, the only European letter in BRICS is Russia, and there is a huge question mark whether, let's say, Russia could represent Europe in this kind of emerging cooperation, the kind of question mark that wasn't there 10 or 15 years ago, I would argue. So this is part of it. The second part of it is the fundamental difference between the structure of something like BRICS, or if you look at ASEAN, for example, or OAS, the Organization of African States, and something like the European Union or NATO, or you could look at a couple others. So it is a little bit like
ASEAN is just to clarify.
Association of Southeast Asian Nations.
Yes, thank you.
So if you look at BRICS or if you look at ASEAN, a couple of others, you have to appreciate that this is an alliance of nations for whom the principle of non-intervention is one of the core values of diplomacy. So basically, it is an association of nations who approach each other from the perspective of non-commitment to alliances. So it is by definition, it is not going to go deeper than a certain level. If you look at the European Union, like yielding sovereignty between European Union states has been a debate for the last, I don't know, at least 25 years after the European Union's member states agreed to move into a direction of giving up certain level of sovereignty and created a common currency and created a common agriculture policy and defense policy. And, we very often don't appreciate this kind of thing. So the money that you use, the food that you eat, water, energy, it goes very, very, very deep. This was historically an almost unbelievable level of commitment. The way, let's say, or the United States of America was created is the same, or any other federalist state like Mexico. In Asia is completely different because these nations are at a different stage of nationhood. They have been independent nations for since too recently to give up this kind of sovereignty. So they are committed to certain things and not committed to certain other things. So the EU has a very similar dilemma towards something like BRICS or ASEAN, as China has towards the EU. But the EU is still much more aligned and approachable as a central entity than BRICS or ASEAN, right? So basically, it's like, whose phone number do you keep in your phone when you want to call BRICS or when you want to call ASEAN? China has an answer about this. Obviously, Russia has an answer about this. The EU doesn't. So actually, I wrote my first graduate thesis about EU and ASEAN, both comparative and the diplomatic relations between the two. And that was easily 25 years ago. So we still have this kind of dilemma. Now, let's imagine that something of a policy in EU is emerging. And now we add 5 more states to BRICS, right? Back to the drawing board. So I think it's useful for the EU that these states communicate with each other and communicate some kind of a vision of their own cooperation between one another. I don't think it's an equal dialogue between, let's say, EU and BRICS.
I find it difficult to understand the nature of this alliance. And I seem to understand that it offers China a platform to promote alternatives to Western norms. Mm-hmm. But how strong is it? Because you have seen that it seems that Brazil and India are not, or South Africa even, are not completely on board on certain topics. There were relations with Italy on some projects, and Italy has stepped away from them. So it's difficult for us to make sense of what BRICS means in terms of alliance.
Well, of course. I mean, I would encourage you to seriously search your network and then find one person in your network from each of these countries who has at least attended one meeting of BRICS or a conference or something where high-level decision makers were there. And what they are going to tell you is that even high-level decision makers will tell you completely different stories of what BRICS is all about. This is certainly what I hear from people who have been in those rooms, right? Because China is currently, what it's trying to do is that China has been admitted to very important institutions of the international system. WTO is obviously the most notable one, but also different decision-making forums of the United Nations. And also there is ASEAN, there was the ASEAN +1, +2, +3, and so on. BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and so on. In China's hopes, all of these vehicles are instruments to shape the international system to a fairer, historically more just future international system, because they firmly believe in the past exploitation of what they call the global south, although most of the so-called global south nations are in the north, so it's a little bit confusing in itself. But anyway, they really believe that there was serious colonial exploitation, and now it's time to get rid of those how do you say, uneven relationships in the world. And they are going to try to use any of these institutions to remedy those past mistakes. If you look at other nations, let's say in BRICS as well, or nations who are trying to join BRICS, there are very, very different interpretations of what is happening here, right? If you just look at the ideological differences between BRICS nations, you can see how vast they can be. If you look at the different levels of development between these nations, or let's say you would be a little bit naughty and you would sit down with these friends who know BRICS a little bit from the perspective of their own nations, and you would just ask them, who is hoping to sell, who's hoping to buy, and what within BRICS? You could start a bar fight that way, right? So it's a little bit like, just like in political alliances, just like in a government, let's say you live in a country where you have elections and you have political coalitions. Forming a coalition against somebody is not the same thing as finding a way to work together.
That is definitely different. Let's look at technology, because it has become one of the sharpest areas of strategic friction. The Huawei controversy reshaped tech diplomacy. With Huawei's exclusion from Europe's 5G networks, a significant shift occurred in tech diplomacy. Was this primarily about security, or did it reflect more profound questions about Europe's alignment with US policy? In a book that was recently published that's called Apple in China, the book seems to suggest that it was to support Apple's development effort in China.
Right. Well, not only that, I would say read Apple with China together with a recent book that was, I'm struggling, House of Huawei. I can't remember the Eva Du or Eva Do, something like that. So read them side by side, because they are absolutely fascinating from many, many different perspectives. One of them, I think it's very important, and it tells us a lot about these two stories, is that Apple in China was based on lots and lots of direct interviews with people who worked in Apple and lead Apple and so on. Whereas the House of Huawei was written entirely without direct interviews with Ren Zhengfei, who is the founder of Huawei, or anybody else who represented Huawei on the high level. So it already tells you an awful lot about how much we can know about this. So this is number one. Number two, especially if I work with European diplomats or high-level executives from Europe who stumble into this story again, as maybe you can see now that in coaching, I always start with empathy, and then read up about the story of Huawei and put yourself into the shoes of Ren Zhengfei, who is the founder of Huawei. And you can also find some older interviews with him on YouTube. I think they are quite interesting. Actually, the story that comes out of it is just the opposite of this kind of agent of the Chinese state who is taking over the world. Actually, I think it's a quite tragic story. Although I also have an enormous amount of respect for the way he goes through it, so to speak. So he has a lot of backbone. This is a person who used to be quite high level as a technical specialist in the People's Liberation Army. So Huawei has its roots in the People's Liberation Army, which is one of the primary reasons why people are so suspicious of the company. But he also realized that as an army engineer, he's not going to be able to build the technological solution that he already saw was possible to build. So he left the army. The army remained one of his top clients, so to speak. So he was still a contractor. But basically, Huawei single-handedly built up China's, and let's be careful, not mobile, landline infrastructure, right? So at that time, China was missing reliable landlines, and this is the way they went into global communications. Like many Chinese firms that we fear on the global stage today, including BYD, they had nothing to do with the international market. They had no ambitions in the international market. They simply wanted to fill a gaping lifestyle gap in China. I don't know if there are Chinese speakers in the audience, so I encourage you to look up the Chinese movie called Mobile Phone in Chinese. It's a very, very funny, like mid-2000s film about just 5 or 10 years before, how primitive the telecom infrastructure was. But I can tell you a very quick personal story. I started learning Mandarin when I arrived in China. I got the Chinese language, like the Chinese textbook of Beida, of Beijing Dashi, which is one of the best universities in China. And we had one chapter, making a phone call, 打电话, right? And then it was, you open it and it's like, I don't know, chapter 3, making a phone call. So the hero of the language textbook goes to the post office, queues, and when he gets his turn, he says, "Comrade, I would like to make an international call," right? And then writes down the number, I think it was a German number, on a piece of paper, gives it to the assistant. Then he has to queue again. And then eventually he's called, like, you can go to booth 6. When I learned from this book, I already had an iPhone 3 in China. Oh, sorry, no. I had a Nokia at that time in China. So that's how quickly everything happened in China. And then suddenly Huawei finds itself invited by countries which were in the former communist bloc, including Hungary, to help build up an early mobile phone infrastructure because they already had the technology. So actually, for example, in countries like Hungary, I will only mention this one country because I know for a fact this happened. Huawei was part of the local infrastructure much earlier than this whole hullabaloo and scandal about Huawei's identity came up. So by the time a lot of Asian, African, European countries were told, you cannot trust Huawei, they had over a decade of involvement with Huawei. Now, again, we can feel empathy towards these decision makers. Like, okay, listen, there is this security infrastructure, there is NATO, there are the Americans, there are eventually also Brits, Australians pushing us to get rid of Huawei. Well, what the hell do we do? You know, it's not like we can call Motorola and tell them replace all the Huawei infrastructure with a better and equally priced one. So again, I don't think there are really good answers here. For a while, I liked the UK's attitude. I don't know if it's still the same, because for a while, what I heard from people who work for the British government is, listen, I know Huawei is smart, but we are smarter. So basically, we will keep working with Huawei, but have a very close eye on them. I think this is probably the most constructive approach.
This conversation runs for about 2 hours, so it was divided into 2 parts, and part 1 ends here. Check out the episode notes to find out more about Gabor Holch, where to get his book, and how to reach him. In part 2 of our conversation, we look beyond the headlines to ask where Europe-China relations are really headed and what it means for the rest of the world. Look for it where you get your podcast and drop me a line to support my work or suggest a topic you would like me to cover.